This is the first of a four-part series examining the evidence surrounding the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These events form the foundation of the Christian faith, and really the Christian faith rises and falls on the historicity, the reliability, the validity of these accounts. And so the series here is based on the book and the video series from Lee Strobel. And each of these four lessons will include a segment and a video presentation by Mr. Strobel of the evidence. And we will take a look at the validity and the reliability of the accounts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let me begin by sharing my screen with you, and we'll get started. This is a quote from a very famous Christian author, C.S. Lewis, from the book Mere Christianity. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. And of course, what he's aiming directly at is those who would point to Jesus as a great moral teacher and a model for us for life, but they are unwilling to consider that he would actually be a divine figure, actually be the Son of God who Christians proclaim. All this in many respects rises and falls on the resurrection itself. It is either the most profound event in all of human history, or it is an amazing legend and myth that has built up over time, and billions of people still believe it. So believing it as an actual historical event is a leap too far for some, as it says here in the notes. And as a result, they don't trust what are purported to be eyewitness accounts there in the Gospels. And as I said, they think it's a legend akin to Robin Hood, having built up over decades and even centuries. Or that some mistake has been made in interpreting things the way that they have been. And some even point to some kind of a grand conspiracy, even going back to the one that is purported to have been presented in the first century, that the disciples stole the body and then went around Jerusalem proclaiming that a resurrection had taken place. Again, this four-part series is going to take a look at the evidence surrounding the crucifixion and the resurrection, and whether in fact we can trust the accounts that we've been given. So we'll start with this first segment of the video presentation from Mr. Strobel.
It was one of the last places I ever expected to be, sitting in the living room of the Playboy Mansion near Los Angeles, across from the most notorious hedonist of his generation, Hugh Hefner, who was wearing his trademark pajamas and silk smoking jacket. At the time, I was hosting a national network television program called Faith Under Fire, and Hefner had agreed to be interviewed about his spiritual outlook. Well, during the interview, Hefner expressed a minimal belief in God as a word for the beginning of it all and the great unknown. He said the God of Christianity was a little too childlike for me. But it was interesting when I brought up the resurrection of Jesus, because he instantly saw the supreme relevance of it. Oh, he said, if one had any real evidence that indeed Jesus did return from the dead, then that is a beginning of a dropping of a series of dominoes that takes us to all kinds of wonderful things. It assures an afterlife and all kinds of things that we would all hope are true. Well, even though he conceded he had never investigated the evidence for himself, Hefner said he was a doubter. He said his rational side couldn't believe it. He concluded, I don't think Jesus is any more the Son of God than we are. Well, Hugh Hefner was right about one thing. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, it changes everything. The resurrection would confirm Jesus' identity as the unique Son of God. It would open the door of heaven for all who follow him. All kinds of wonderful things would fall into place. On the other hand, if it were a mere legend or a mistake, then Jesus would be just one more unfortunate crucifixion victim in a long line of revolutionaries and false messiahs. That's why this study is so important. Over the next 4 sessions, we're going to investigate the historical evidence and see whether it supports or undermines the central claim of Christianity, that Jesus returned from the dead. Now, this is more than just an academic exercise or an exercise in idle curiosity. Rather, it's the journey of a lifetime that really can change everything. I used to be a skeptic about the resurrection of Jesus. I'd seen plenty of dead bodies during my days as a journalist at the Chicago Tribune, and I'm telling you what, not one of them had ever come back to life, especially after 3 days. And I certainly wasn't alone in my disbelief. Muslims say Jesus didn't die on the cross, and therefore there was no resurrection. Specifically, the Quran says this about Jesus in Surah 4, verse 157. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. And many Hindus doubt that the resurrection took place as well. As a prominent Hindu leader declared, Jesus was only injured and after treatment returned to India where he actually died. And of course, atheists discount claims about the resurrection as well. In a recent book, one of them, who was a member of the left-wing Jesus seminar, declared simply, Jesus is dead. Well, it was my wife Leslie's conversion to Christianity that prompted me to use my journalism and legal training to systematically investigate the historical data for the resurrection, which ended up consuming nearly 2 years of my life. I framed the issue this way. Did Jesus claim to be the Son of God, and did he back up that claim by returning from the dead? Now, it's a fundamental teaching of Islam that Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God. My late friend Nabil Qureshi, a Muslim turned Christian, summarized Surah 5, verse 72 by saying, the Quran teaches that he who subscribes to the doctrine of a divine Christ will make his home in the flames of hell. One imam made this contention. There is no single scriptural text in which Jesus claimed explicitly to be divine. And sure enough, as I combed through the New Testament, I couldn't find a single reference where Jesus came out and specifically declared, I am God. However, just because a claim isn't made directly doesn't mean it isn't being made at all. For example, I don't have to explicitly say, my name is Lee, to indicate that that's my name. Instead, I could wear a name tag that said, hello, my name is Lee. Or I could respond affirmatively when someone called me Lee. Or I could show a birth certificate or a driver's license with my name. Or I could say, I'm named after my only uncle, whose name also is Lee. Similarly, Jesus does make unmistakable divine claims about himself throughout Scripture. In fact, let's go back to the first gospel that was written, the Gospel of Mark, and see how people reacted to these claims of Jesus. In Mark chapter 2, for example, some friends brought a paralyzed man to Jesus, and Jesus said to him, Son, your sins are forgiven. Now, immediately, the religious leaders reacted by thinking, he's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? How is he committing blasphemy? Well, he's doing something only God can do. He's forgiving sins. And oh, by the way, he also miraculously healed the paralytic. Later, in Mark 14, verses 55 through 64, Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin on his way to the cross. The high priest asked Jesus point blank, under oath, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus replied, "I am. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Well, let's unpack Jesus' response. He begins with, "I am," which is how God refers to himself in the Old Testament. You might remember in Exodus, Moses asked God what he should say if the Israelites ask him for God's name. God says to Moses, "This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." Then Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. In fact, this is the most common way that he refers to himself throughout Mark's gospel. Now, initially, I presume this was merely a claim to being human, but actually, the opposite is true. This was a reference to Daniel chapter 7, starting at verse 13, where the Son of Man is a divine figure. He is in the very presence of the Father. He has authority, glory, and sovereign power. He is worshiped by all nations, even though only God alone can be legitimately worshiped. And he will come at the end of the world to judge humankind and rule forever. And Jesus says he will be sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. That's a reference to Psalm 110, and again, a claim to being Lord. Now, here's the key. How did the high priest understand what Jesus was saying? Well, he was outraged, and he tore his clothes and said, "Why do we need any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy." That is, blasphemy because he was claiming to be God. And verse 64 says, they all condemned him as worthy of death. All through the Gospels, Jesus' claims to divinity were crystal clear to his audiences, as if he said outright, "I am God." For instance, in John 10, verse 30, Jesus declared, "I and the Father are one." And the Greek word there for one is not masculine, it's neuter. This means Jesus was not saying, "I and the Father are the same person." Rather, he was saying, "I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence." And how does the audience respond? Oh, verses 31 through 33 say, "Again, the Jewish opponents picked up stones to kill him, but Jesus said to them, 'I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me?' 'We are not stoning you for any good work,' they replied, 'but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God.'" Friends, Jesus made transcendent, messianic, and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. But so what? I could claim to be the Son of God. Anybody could claim to be divine. But here's the thing. If Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, died, and then rose from the dead 3 days later, then that's a pretty good indication he's telling the truth. This is why the resurrection is the centerpiece of the Christian faith. As the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins." In short, if the resurrection is false, then Christianity is refuted. In fact, Paul is basically saying that if the resurrection is a fraud or a mistake or a legend or make-believe, then it would be entirely appropriate for Christians to simply walk away from the faith. Fortunately, however, Christianity is an investigatable religion. Now think about that. The origins of many world religions are lost in the mists of history. But Christianity makes specific claims about events that supposedly occurred in time and space right there in the first century. Those events can be checked out. They can be probed. And when we scrutinize the data of history, what do we find? We discover 4 facts which establish convincingly that Jesus rose from the dead. Each one begins with the letter E to make it easy to remember. I actually got this idea from my good friend Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the great resurrection scholars who used to use 3 E's to summarize the evidence. I like to use 4 E's. Now, the first E stands for the word execution. Jesus was dead after being executed by the Romans at the behest of the Jewish leaders. Now, some skeptics claim that Jesus somehow survived the crucifixion and that the cold, damp air of the tomb revived him. So we don't have a divine resurrection. Instead, we just have a fortuitous resuscitation. But after you hear the evidence for the crucifixion, you'll see that this explanation simply is ruled out by the historical data. First, before he was crucified, Jesus was flogged by Roman soldiers. In fact, he was evidently flogged 2 separate times. To understand how we reach that conclusion, let me give you some background on Roman floggings. The New Testament scholar David Croteau points out that there were actually 3 levels of floggings, each with their own name. The first was the least severe and was given for light offenses. Typically, the victim would then be given a warning not to violate the law again. The second kind of flogging was a severe one that was given to criminals who had committed serious crimes. The third was the most brutal kind of whipping, which was always a precursor to capital punishment, usually by crucifixion. This beating was so cruel that sometimes the victim would die from the effects of the flogging itself before he even got to the cross. The victim would be tied to a post and beaten with a braided leather whip that had broken pieces of glass and bone and metal in it to tear the flesh. The whipping would have gone from the shoulders down to the back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs. Sometimes the spine itself would be exposed. One physician who has studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. One eyewitness to a Roman flogging described it this way: the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles and tendons and bowels of the victim were laid open to exposure. Why does Croteau believe that Jesus was flogged twice? Well, he went through the 4 gospel accounts of the trial and beating of Jesus and found that they all fit together into 8 steps. First, Pilate threatened to flog Jesus lightly and then release him. Second, the crowd asked for Barabbas to be released instead of Jesus. Third, Pilate threatens again to flog Jesus lightly and then release him. Fourth, the crowd pressures Pilate. Fifth, Pilate has Jesus lightly flogged. That is described in John 19, verse 1. In fact, the Greek word used to describe the level of flogging, mystago, suggests that this kind of punishment would have been typically decreed by a synagogue. Sixth, Pilate tries to release Jesus after the flogging. Seventh, Pilate gives in to the pressure and sentences Jesus to crucifixion. Eighth, Pilate has Jesus flogged again, as referenced in Matthew 27, verse 26. The Greek word for the flogging here is phrygelou, which is defined in one lexicon as being a punishment inflicted after a sentence of death has been pronounced. So Jesus apparently received 2 floggings, one of them being the least severe and the other being the most severe. Now, the Bible limits floggings to 39 lashes in Deuteronomy 25, verses 1 through 3. But there was no reason the Roman soldiers had to abide by that limit, and it's highly unlikely they did when beating Jesus. I interviewed a medical expert on the crucifixion, and he said there is evidence that Jesus was in hypovolemic shock, that is, shock from a great loss of blood after that second flogging. That's evident from the fact that Jesus collapsed under the weight of the horizontal beam of the cross as he carried it to Calvary. Also, one of the symptoms of hypovolemic shock is a great thirst as the body craves fluids to replace the low blood volume. And we read later how Jesus said, "I thirst," on the cross, which is when a sip of vinegar was offered to him. Dr. Alexander Metherell, a physician who has extensively studied the crucifixion of Jesus, told me this. He said, "Because of the terrible effects of this beating, there's no question that Jesus was already in serious to critical condition even before the nails were driven through his hands and feet." Then Jesus was crucified. We'll investigate in the next session what this entailed and determine the actual cause of death. In the meantime, it's sobering to consider the amount of suffering that Jesus endured as he fulfilled the mission of atoning for the sins of the world. And think about it, it was his choice to do it. It was a mission that he accepted. What in the world could have motivated him to say yes? Well, as Dr. Metherell said to me, so when you ask what motivated him, well, I suppose the answer can be summed up in one word, and that word would be love. Love for you and for me. Sometimes I think Christians sort of assume that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and we look askance at skeptics and others who say, well, he never really did. But it can be a good thing to go back and review those instances in which he asserted his deity and offered his messianic credentials. In the end, the evidence is compelling, and is made especially clear by the reaction of his audiences when they declared blasphemy. Of course, it wasn't blasphemy if his divine claims were actually true, and his resurrection shows us that they were. There are a lot of implications for us if Jesus returned from the dead, but none more powerful than what was told by a philosopher who I interviewed. He said, God took the very worst thing that could ever happen in the history of the universe, deicide, or the death of God's Son on the cross, and he turned it into the very best thing that could ever happen in the history of the universe, which is the opening of heaven for all who follow him. And if God can take the absolute worst thing and turn it into the indisputably best thing, then what problem, what circumstance, what challenge, what weakness, or what mistake in your own life are you convinced that he can't help you overcome?
So let's just take a look at some of the things, a quick review of some of the things that Lee Strobel was presenting to us. Obviously, he talked about the fact that some say that there was no point in during Jesus's life where he proclaimed himself to be divine. But as you saw in the presentation, there are several places within the scripture where we get quotes from Jesus or actions from Jesus or responses from those who heard him that indicate that clearly he was claiming to be a divine figure. And Lee Strobel pointed out some of those scriptural passages to us. For example, the one in John 10:30, where he says that he and the Father, I and the Father, are one and the same, basically. And of course, the response from those around him at this point and others, where they pick up stones to stone him for blasphemy, understanding that indeed he did claim to be a divine figure, to be God in the flesh. And of course, the other thing that he emphasized, that, as I had pointed out before the video, that Christianity is based on historical events, and in particular, the crucifixion, and in this case, the resurrection. And Christianity rises and falls on whether those are reliable historical events or just myth and legend. Again, just to summarize that Mr. Strobel brought up the 4 E's that he's going to be covering in these lessons, and we're going to be covering: execution, early, empty, eyewitnesses. And of course, he talked quite a bit about the execution itself, the flogging, the fact that there were likely 2 floggings, the effects of those floggings from a medical and physical standpoint. And certainly the fact that Romans were very good at performing executions. Certainly there is no evidence that anybody, Jesus or anybody else, actually survived a crucifixion. And especially as you consider the flogging that was performed prior to nailing someone to a cross, and considering the medical effects of just the flogging itself. And again, he showed that picture of the actual cat o' nine tails that was used, the fragments of bone and stone and even glass that would be at the ends of it, so it would rip away at the flesh. And again, understanding that the person would necessarily be in shock before they were nailed to the cross. And of course, there are accounts of, as he said, of people actually dying from the flogging itself. And of course, at the end, when they stick the spear into Jesus's side to make sure that he's dead, and of course they find that he is, which is why they end up not breaking his leg bones. And they do break the legs of the thieves that are next to him because they were not quite dead yet. The reason for that, and I think he's going to cover this in the next lesson, is because it would hasten asphyxiation, because you could not kind of push up from your legs to basically allow your lungs to expand. And so it would hasten death very, very quickly at that point. And there are just a couple of questions that you may want to ponder after having seen this lesson and heard all of this information. Do you still have doubts that Jesus claimed to be divinity? Was there anything in this lesson about the execution which you hadn't heard before? For me, this was sort of the first time I had heard about the idea of there being 2 different floggings. Is there any part about the execution itself which strikes you the most? What other questions have you heard from unbelievers or skeptics relative to Jesus's claiming to be divine? And before this particular lesson and hearing this information, had you ever heard of anyone claiming Jesus didn't actually die on the cross? I do happen to be familiar with claims of other faith systems and other folks, other skeptics relative to that. So I had heard that before. Have you ever heard of anyone denying Jesus even existed? We're not going to go in so much into that in this particular lesson, but there despite an awful lot of historical evidence that Jesus, at the very least, was a historical figure that actually lived and walked on the earth, there are still some who deny that. And did you learn anything new from this particular lesson? Hopefully you did. So that is the first lesson. There are going to be 3 ensuing lessons, and I hope that you will tune into them as well. And as I said, hopefully you learned something new about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And we'll come back for more. Thanks for joining.